Welcome. My name is David Pietrzewski.
And I'm David Pinsoff.
And David, what is this?
As far as I'm aware, it's Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast. And what
Yeah.
is the tagline again?
The tagline is two guys nerding out about evolutionary psychology. Oh no, that was
Oh,
the
that you
alternative.
said the subtext there. You should have said the actual. You mixed them up.
Oh, okay. So it's evolutionary psychology, the podcast, actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists.
Right. And it really is two guys nerding out about evolutionary psychology, but we don't say that because it's not a very appealing tagline.
Typically with a guest.
Yeah, usually we have a guest,
And we
and
have a
today
great
we have a.
we have a great guest, a scary episode, but we'll tell you about that in a second.
Yep.
David, I love this time of year because I don't know. I always fall was always my favorite time of year. Even in Southern California, I still like the idea that like Halloween's coming around the corner.
Yeah, I think Halloween is my favorite holiday because it combines spooky things with candy, which are two of my
What's
favorite
not to
things in
like?
life.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
what's not to like? I think I made that exact same joke in the episode, so you'll get to hear this joke twice. Lucky you.
I once had a teacher who I thought was a really good teacher, and then it was in college, and then she literally forgot that she had done the class beforehand, and so she just started doing it again, and it was literally word for word, and it
Oh
freaked me
no.
out. It was like robotic. I mean, she was quite old. I mean, she was lovely, but I think she had just sort of but it was interesting. But anyway, it was
Well,
yeah.
well, that response being freaked out
Oh,
is
good.
what this episode is about. So who do we have in this
We
episode?
we have Coltan Scrivner, and he studies morbid curiosity and horror movies and horror genre and fiction. He does basically the evolutionary psychology of horror and things all around that.
Yes, and today is the day that his book, Morbidly Curious, is coming out. So you'll get to hear all about his research and decide whether you want to buy his book, which, spoiler alert, you absolutely should because it's a great book.
Yeah, and David, it sounds like you read it already. Yeah,
I did. I got an advance copy and I blurbed it. So
look at
another
you.
bonus
Wow,
is
good.
if you buy the book, you'll get to see my awesome blurb.
Look at this jet setter getting
Yeah.
advanced copies of books and blurbing them. All right. Without further ado, it's a really fun episode, and if you're interested in scary things, or if you're anxious, I would
hmm
I would say this is a great episode to listen to.
Yeah, no, we get a lot into the mechanics of anxiety and how horror can potentially be therapeutic for anxious people. So we cover a lot of ground. It's a really awesome conversation. I had a blast,
Yeah.
and I'm
Oh,
sure you'll have a blast listening.
one quick thing to say: we do talk about how it's probably a good idea to like let people who are anxious or who want to consume scary things consume them. But one thing we didn't say that I think is worth saying is that does not mean you should force people into
Yes.
doing that, because that's a very different thing. You should let people satisfy their own appetites, which is a very different thing than forcing people who don't want to consume something scary. I just want to note that before, because we don't really mention that in the episode.
Yes. Good caveat. Well, without further ado, let us begin the spookiness.
Ooh. Oh, that was wow, David. That's a really good go. Oh,
Was
wow.
that a good
Yeah, that's a
ghost
good
sound?
go. So,
We're here.
David, happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween to you as well, and to you, Colton Scrivner, who is with us here to talk about all things spooky and horrifying.
Can I
Yeah.
just,
Why
can
we
I, just-
celebrate Halloween anyway?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
love Halloween. I don't know. How do you feel about Halloween, David?
I love. It's actually probably my favorite holiday. I mean, it's candy, it's spooky. It's the two of my favorite things.
Yeah, Colton, we'll say hello to you in a second, but we want to get right into how do you feel about Halloween? Like, did you enjoy Halloween as a kid?
Sure. I think most kids probably enjoy Halloween, maybe for different reasons. I don't know, but I think most kids at least enjoy the candy aspect of it, and the play pretend aspect. I think that every kid probably enjoys that.
Yeah, did you have a thing where you like made your own costumes? Were you super into costumes, or was it like a last minute thing?
I am not crafty enough to make my own costume and make it any kind of fun for anyone. So, but I am in love the costume thing. Still do it as an adult for certain events here in town. But Yeah, definitely don't make my own.
Cool.
Did you dress like more of a standard spooky way, like you dressed as like a scary serial killer or monster, or were you more like the Spider-Man, Superman type?
I was usually a dead something, like a dead
Mm.
Interesting.
army guy or
Okay.
a dead whatever, or a vampire, or just like things that were dead.
Even isn't it
Hmm.
even as a child?
Yeah, like not real scary, but still dead.
Okay, interesting. We're just going to ask you about your Halloween experiences for
Yeah,
the
just my
next
kid. Just ask me
three
about my
hours.
childhood
Yes,
and
exactly. That's we orbit around that all the time on this podcast. So yeah.
Yeah. No, honestly, I'm glad we have you on, just because my daughter is very morbidly curious, and
Mm.
understanding your research and the development of morbid curiosity has helped me to deal with that as a parent and sort of harness it and nurture it. But yeah, it's been very cool to witness.
yeah,
Just one anecdote. I was trying to get her to brush her teeth because she doesn't like brushing her teeth, and so I decided to show her pictures of rotting teeth to show
Mm.
her what happens to your teeth if you don't brush it. And it was actually a very effective way of getting her. Now she always is willing to brush her teeth, but it had this
Parent
humorous side
hacks. Parent
effect.
hacks. Okay.
It had a side effect, which is now she just wants to look at pictures of rotting teeth for fun. And now now I can use it as a reward. Like, oh, if you clean up
yeah.
your toys, I'll let you look at pictures of rotting teeth.
David, in Germany, there's like a part of anti-smoking campaign is there's like at the grocery store in the checkout aisle, there's like you can buy cigarettes and there's pictures of like really like like I don't even know how to describe it, but like really gross like medical pictures that are the
Mhm.
results of smoking. And I'm just imagining your daughter going, oh, like grabbing the cigarette.
I'll take two.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah,
David will be here all week for parent hacks. So.
cool.
Yeah.
Yep.
Colton, can you, so I don't know if you want to just talk about morbid curiosity as a broad thing, but one question I think a lot of people will have is, so you're taking an evolutionary approach, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, to our interest in things that are gross or scary,
Mhm.
or sort of just to understand what swath of science or human phenomena you're carving out. How would you characterize the thing that you are interested in that's sort of been the North Star for
Yeah.
your writing and your research and what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely trained. Was trained as a in anthropology and biology, and so, but I'm interested in humans, and so in the wonderful world of science, that means you do psychology things. But I do take a different perspective, obviously, than most psychologists, but pretty similar to the two of you, which is, I think that humans are evolved creatures, and that influences in our psychology and can help. If we use an evolutionary perspective, it can help us understand human behavior pretty well. And there's been a lot of work on why humans are, or the fact that humans are sort of drawn to threats, or drawn to negativity, or drawn to things that they may otherwise try to avoid. But as far as I can tell, when I started researching this, nobody had really tried to explain that any further than, oh yeah, we negative things jump out to us, or in some cases, like, oh, threatening things seem to jump out to us even more than negative things. And so what I've done is try to understand why that is, but then also why we not only why does it jump out to us, but why do we seek it out and create it and enjoy it even. Um, yeah, and then further than that, I mean, I'm working on a paper right now with Edgar Deborg, looking at, can we understand the horror genre specifically from an evolutionary perspective, and sort of what inputs is our mind taking from a horror movie that make it interesting, that make it scary, and how can we better understand the emotion of fear by looking at the entertainment we produce.
Yeah.
Cool. One of the things that Dave and I talked about doing as just adaptationists is you just go around the world, and whether it's like the thing your daughter or your son is doing or just people are doing online, is sort of just being an anthropologist about it and sort of thinking about, well, what are the combination or cocktail of adaptations underlying this thing.
Right.
And I actually find myself being kind of doing that implicitly, like about Halloween and horror stuff. And I don't even actually know what that category is. And I'm curious if you have some intuition about what that category is. But like to me, I find it interesting, for example, that like along with obviously things like, scary, threatening things. There's also like things being old and like
Mm,
cobwebby. And I don't know how much of that is sort of like, universal, how much of it is just sort of like the cultural evolution baggage of just like
right.
this is traditionally what it's like a Victorian home, right? Like,
Right.
but it's also interesting that it's like an older architecture or there's evidence of like past agents and it's unclear. So like
Hmm.
I'm just I am personally very curious about like, and I would love to hear like what is your if you've been thinking about like what's the grammar of what this category is, and is it incidental or is it like a feature that there's like cobwebs and dust, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a big question, right? Because I think there's the question of what are the features of all the dangerous things we might be interested in. And then there are the features of what are those things that we seem to latch onto and produce in material culture, right? And replicate. So, kind of what are those broad features? And then what are the ones that really seem to get our attention to the extent that we tell stories about them and then consume those stories, spend resources to consume those stories.
Right.
I think the cobweb thing and like abandoned buildings thing is interesting. I did an interview, I don't know, a couple months ago about abandoned theme parks, and we sort of explored that question a little further because it's something that I hadn't thought about too much. I mean, I think just sort of from my gut and having studied these things, one thing that it might be is that, if you see somewhere that looks like it has a lot of resources, could be a good place to live, and you see that it's abandoned, you might ask, well, why would people leave such a rich place of resources, right? And one answer is that, well, because it's actually more dangerous than it looks, right?
Mm.
I think we do that with ancient civilizations. I think that's one reason we find like the ancient Mayan civilizations and just ancient civilizations generally kind of interesting to us. It's like, well, if they built all these great things, they must have had great resources. So what happened, or where did they go? And the obvious answer, and the one that archaeologists often look to, is disaster, right? And so if this great civilization in this case didn't see this disaster coming, like what did they miss? What got them? And could it happen to me? Right? Could it happen to us? So that's my first instinct. And of course, cobwebs, at least in, I don't know, not a cobweb expert, so I don't know if they show up around the world in different kinds of materials. But in the U.S. at least, and in many places, cobwebs signify we understand that signifies it's been abandoned for a while or not taken care of. And so if we see them in a big, beautiful house, like a big castle, again, there's like all these resources. We understand all these resources were poured into building this beautiful castle. Someone of great power must have lived there, and yet they're gone, and their family is gone. So what happened?
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
those are more like cues of danger in some ways, right? Like
Yeah.
accidental or incidental cues of danger.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're saying that. I'm imagining like the opening scenes of a movie and like what's scarier, like imagining like the three of us walking through a town and there's nobody in it. And you
Right.
go into the houses and like even the stove is on and
Mm-hmm.
there's still food cooking and burning and
Mm-hmm.
like everything is but everybody's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
there's
that's
nobody
exactly
there.
the first
That would
episode of The Twilight Zone, isn't it? Like he's walking
mm,
around and it's just like an empty town.
right.
And it's very eerie, very creepy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so I love that. And I love that that example then also highlights this sort of, if you take a step back, and I love this about an evolutionary approach too, is you think about like we're organisms and we're starting to like get into that. What we're talking about is curiosity or information seeking about a class of things that might be relevant for it. Like in the same way, a rat might be interested in like the things around a dead rat, so long as it doesn't like kill the rat for
Mm-hmm.
sort of obvious reasons, right? And maybe that's too facile, but like I like that. Like I was thinking about, like whenever we have somebody on, I sort of think about what to think about. And I think like what liking like horror or like liking things that are a little bit gross or scary to me feels like very deeply human in the same way of like getting paper cuts or like sneezing is, it's just like
Yeah.
one of these things that's just very human.
Well, I
Is
think importantly though, you don't have to like something to find it interesting either. There's actually like empirical
mm,
evidence for that you can distinguish liking and finding things interesting. Now you can have both, right? You can like something and find it interesting, but you can certainly find things interesting and be intrigued and drawn and have these approach motivations toward it without actually enjoying it.
Right.
And I think morbid curiosity does a little of both of those, right? It's kind of got a two-pronged access to our minds. And I'm still kind of teasing that apart, like what it looks like and why in some people it's approach and like or interest and like, and why in some people it's just interest.
Mhm. So I feel like we sort of skipped ahead a bit. We didn't get to the foundation, the basic question
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
has been driving your research, which is why are we into this stuff?
Yeah.
From a naive psychological perspective, you might expect us to entertain ourselves with images of sunshine and rainbows and happy families and peaceful interactions. And yet, if you look at the actual contents of the entertainment and the fiction that we consume, it is filled with blood and gore and terror. So why would we, if we have the option to entertain ourselves with any kind of imaginary world that we want, why would
Mhm.
we pick the scariest, darkest, most awful stuff to
Yeah.
entertain ourselves with? Why are we into this stuff to begin with?
Well, I think it's because historically we've encountered it in the real world, right? And
Hmm.
anytime you can learn about something cheaply from an sort of an ecological perspective, your mind snags that, right? It's just like the drink that Dave is drinking there probably has a bit of a sweet taste, right? Probably tells his mind that this is high calorie, it's good, you should consume it. I think a similar thing happens with fear when we see something dangerous on our screen, or even we're imagining it or reading it in a book, hearing a story from someone. Our mind is getting one set of input information that says, here's some important information, you should pay attention. But the sort of brakes aren't really applied that would normally be applied, because we're not getting input saying the dangerous thing is in front of us, which is how almost every animal ever experiences threat, right? Is in order to learn about it, you kind of have to be there, because they don't have material culture that they transmit, and they don't have sophisticated language that they can tell stories about dangerous things. So they kind of have to learn about them firsthand. And they do. You do see that in the animal kingdom. You see something like morbid curiosity in a lot of animals, but it's much more restricted. Like you only see it in certain circumstances, whereas in humans, we can consume it almost anytime, anywhere. So it's kind of like the candy thing, right? It's kind of like, why do we like sweet things? Well, it's a cheap way to get calories, even when we shouldn't want calories. Sometimes it's a cheap way to get calories, and we latch onto that.
Yeah, this might be a good place to talk about sort of signal detection or error management too, right? Is that sort of something you've thought about? So, in other words, if there's a really high cost or really high threat thing, it's not always clear whether or not you're going to learn something, but there's two types of errors to make, right? One is you sort of pursue or look into this dangerous or scary or high cost thing and don't learn anything, versus you could have, but you don't. And then, so for example, I when I lived in Berlin, I did open water swimming. I moved here to Santa Barbara. There's the Pacific Ocean here is a great white nursery, right? So I was like, I'm going to look into everything I can about great white sharks, to just settle on, am I actually going to go swimming and what's my relative risk?
Right.
Is that thing of sort of uh, because one question is sort of like, what lessons are people learning, if at all? And is that sort of like a kludginess of the system that
Yeah.
all consume things that are scary just because that's just the way the system is built? Or are people actually learning lessons?
I think there's a little of both. I think most people when they go to they buy a ticket to a horror movie, you don't really think about like, oh, I'm going to learn something from this. Some people do. I've actually talked to people in studies that, especially with true crime, they'll say, I watched this to kind of pick up on what I would have missed, right? If this were to happen to me. And there's some evidence that feeling vulnerable is correlated with your chances of like truly feeling vulnerable and seeking out these things are correlated with your chances of being a victim of a crime or having been a victim of a crime in the past. And so I think some people do actively seek it out to learn something, and they're sort of aware of that, but most people just do it because it feels fun, it feels enjoyable. And then the question is, well, why does it feel fun, why does it feel enjoyable? And one answer is that learning is intrinsically rewarding. If you're updating your model of the world and feeling like you're gaining valuable information on the cheap, that's intrinsically rewarding, even if we don't consciously recognize that.
Okay. So the reason why we're into horror is because we're learning things, and we're learning things cheaply, about really important things that we should want to learn about from an evolutionary perspective. If we're going to
Right. I
learn
would say
about any,
those are like really high value things, or things of very high importance, right?
yeah,
Whereas, food is important and mating is important, but they're not one-offs. It's like if you make a mistake with food or make a mistake with mating, usually you can get another chance to get an apple or a mate. If you make a mistake when it comes to a dangerous predator, you may not have another shot, right? And so they're like really high value targets or really high value information. And so I think it's especially potent to us, which is probably why we see this threat bias that humans have, where it kind of captures our attention above and beyond almost anything else.
Yeah, can I interject too? I think one thing and David alluded to this in an earlier episode, there's an idea that there's a reason why we have episodic memory versus semantic memory. Episodic meaning, for people who don't know, is that there's the details of an event. So, do you remember the first time you went on a Ferris wheel, for example, versus just the declarative statement, I was on a Ferris wheel, but you don't remember the event. And it seems to me, and Colton, you can tell me if this is correct, is that if I think about it, hearing about, oh, sharks are dangerous, like that's super boring. I don't care. I would not like choose to do that. But if you told me a story about a shark encounter or a video of it, I would be really interested in watching that. And I wonder if one of the arguments for why we have episodic representations, it's sort of like a picture's worth 1,000 words, is that
Right.
there's a lot of information, and there's also information that you may not already I mean, we'll just use this colloquially, but like that you may not know what lesson to draw from this episode. So the most economical thing to do in terms of evolved representation is store the episode. And it's the fact that it's related to this high fitness cost thing, and it's stored as an episode, that there's sort of constant machinery running to sort of extract what is the inference, and with varying levels of certainty or uncertainty. And so maybe it's no accident that we're really drawn to stories and episodic formats, and it's in fact that the lesson isn't super clear. And maybe if the lesson is too clear, it actually isn't that interesting. And part of what counts as interesting is it's this really kind of Goldilocks middle ground of there's enough content and specifics to possibly extract something,
Mhm.
but at the same time, it's not super clear what the bottom line thing is, where
Right.
if it's sort of super obvious, and I don't know if there's been research on this, but that seemed to be like maybe sort of an alien's perspective of like, what's the middle ground sort of sweet spot in terms of what makes something quote unquote interesting.
Yeah, and I think you hear this a lot from. There's kind of this meme online of horror fans, and often it's like you'll see the meme with like women. It's like, oh, a lot of women will turn on true crime to relax at night, right? They'll turn on stories of mostly men killing mostly women to relax at night. And I've had a lot of people ask me like, how could that be? Like, why would you do that? And I don't have an empirical answer for it, but I have maybe like an intuition about what it might be, which is that if you watch a lot of, let's say, true crime in particular, because there tend to be similarities between cases, right? And in true crime, people do pay attention to those. There is evidence that people find most interesting pieces of the story that tell you like how someone got away or how they didn't. Like those are there's some really cool manipulation studies showing that those are the most interesting parts of the story to most people. And I think what happens probably is that if you watch a lot of those, you get really good at guessing who the bad guy is, why he did it, what the victim should have seen that they didn't. And that can be really comforting to know that you're guessing all these things correctly, right? That can actually probably be relaxing, even if the material itself is horrible or dangerous or violent or whatever, threatening. If you're just guessing it accurately, like bam, 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 one after another, it's going to feel a little bit relaxing. Like, why do you have to worry? You already know this, right? It's like affirmation that you're prepared almost.
Right.
And I think you do get that. You get that with like people who've watched a lot of horror movies too. And they kind of can guess what's going on, which horror movies most of them are not known for being particularly complex about like what you should do and shouldn't do. And it can get kind of relaxing and almost comedic. You can kind of then lean into the comedic side of things without it feeling too taboo, because it's like, oh, well, of course that teenager died. They shouldn't have been doing that. Right. And you get this kind of lax approach to danger. And I think it can then become more of a thing you turn on before you go to bed.
So counterintuitively, it's that I think we have this cartoonish view of things where, bad stimuli equal fear. But
Right.
it sounds like what
Right.
you're saying is that, in fact, fear, and I think people have made this argument before too, is that, or at least anecdotally, that fear is sort of a system for capturing more information. It's a symptom that you haven't done your homework, basically.
Mm,
And I've heard this from people who do like rock climbing or really high stakes life and death things,
right.
that if you actually practice and learn enough, that there's still a notion of sort of how risky something is, but the fear sort of goes away. And it's so this idea is that counterintuitively, it sounds like what you're saying is by exposing yourself to these concerns, it might actually make the fear less.
Or your confidence goes up and that counteracts it, right?
Mm, mm,
And we can talk about this now or later, but I've then taken that exact sort of premise and then expanded this into, well, then can you use horror to help you not feel so anxious or to give you tools to overcome anxiety,
mm,
right?
mm.
And not that horror is necessarily uniquely suited to that, though I do think it does have some benefits certainly over other entertainment genres. But yeah, I think that you can take that exact premise and then say, okay, well, then maybe we can sort of leverage scary stories to help us in some ways.
Right.
Hmm. I mean, what do you see so we obviously know that, or the hypothesis is that it's helping us learn about dangerous things so that we could be better prepared for dealing with them, so that we could better avoid them. And it's not obvious in advance what types of information, what details are going to be important when it comes to a dangerous thing. So if you see a lion versus a tiger, knowing that tigers are striped and lions aren't, that information, it might seem like an irrelevant detail, but it could save your life in some situations. Knowing that the different habits of the two different types of animals, where they like to congregate, whether they like to stalk their prey or whether they just kind of, gallivant out in the open. Each one of these subtle details could be a detail that means the difference between life or death.
Yeah,
Um,
David, can I interject? So never
sure.
swim. This is just a PSA. Never like panic and swim away from a great white shark. We haven't talked about the asymmetric war of attrition, but they're asymmetric war of attrition creatures where if you don't act like prey, you just stand your ground, look at them, and stay facing them. If you ever see one in the water, you're more than likely going to be okay. You're
It's
bigger
like a
than that prey.
bear.
So it's exactly like a bear or a mountain lion. Never run away. Never splash away. Don't freak out. That can be the difference between like activating this creature's like predation response versus it just being
Mm-hmm.
like, well, you're pretty big, you seem comfortable, I'm not going to go after you. So
Yeah.
exactly, yes, like I'm not to just like to call back, like I'm not afraid of going in the water as much now that I know that. But that, David, that's a perfect example of like I didn't know that before I moved to Santa Barbara and I did a deep dive into it. I'm not curious about great white sharks anymore, but that would be an example, David, of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and
Cool.
there's a whole lot of directions I can go from that because that ties into like everything that I am working on now and also that I've worked on in the past with like formidability assessments. And I have this project I've been working on with Edgar, trying to define the horror genre almost using an evolutionary perspective. And kind of what we landed on, and we tested this empirically in a lot of different ways, is that fear in the case of these stories, and probably in the case of many things, has to do with relative formidability asymmetries. So that just such that if you um, either yourself or if you're empathizing with, for example, a protagonist who is more vulnerable, less formidable than the antagonist, it's going to produce fear, right? Like that's the thing that should produce fear, especially if that antagonist is, and maybe only if that antagonist is malicious, right? And if they're around you, near you, pursuing you. And we find that like that's kind of a unique narrative structure in horror that reliably elicits everything from like higher chance of the word fear being included in the description to higher heart rates when you're watching the film. So I think it's probably some of the input conditions, I guess, that like fear generally takes is how vulnerable am I to this thing, right? Is it near me? Is it bigger than me? Is it stronger than me? Does it have more resources than me? Can it outcompete me, essentially? So you can think of vulnerability kind of as a felt appraisal of being less formidable in an asymmetric contest.
Hmm. What you're saying suggests that there could be a Darwinian advantage to mastering your fear. So
For sure.
if predators, either actual predators or social predators, use your fear as a cue of the
Lower
probability of success,
formidability, and
yeah,
yeah, and you'll
if
defer.
and you'll defer to me, you're less formidable to me. If you're afraid of me,
Mm-hmm.
that's a good sign that I should attack you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah,
But if you're not afraid, then that suggests to me that you know something I don't. You might be harder
exactly.
to attack than I think, and I might leave you alone. And so
Exactly.
it could suggest that if you have learned a lot about a dangerous stimulus, and you are signaling that you're not afraid, then that could reduce your chances of actually being harmed. On the other hand, if you signal that you're very afraid, that could actually increase the chances that the danger will actually manifest.
Right.
Would you do you buy that logic?
I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's like, I think a very coherent way of putting a lot of the things that I've thought about in relation to this. And like, again, I think you identified probably something that like an insight that could be applied broadly, to everything from business negotiations to clinical anxiety, right? This idea that, and we talk about it all the time in colloquial terms, right? It's just confidence, right? It's just your confidence, and not mistaking confidence for competence on your own, right? Like understanding where your position is, but maybe putting forward your best foot forward, or we have all kinds of sayings for these kinds of things. But I think that's exactly right. If that's true, then those things should also be true. And I don't have empirical evidence that those things are true, but I'm also not looked into the literature for things like, again, negotiations probably is where that would be a huge, or politics, even political negotiations, wartime negotiations, probably huge implications like that. That insight probably has huge implications for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it would be fascinating to test that empirically, to just have, the person you're negotiating with or you're playing an economic game with, have them look afraid, have a fear face versus have them
Mm-hmm.
not have a fear face, and see how that changes people's behavior, have people rate their physical formidability, their social formidability. Does the fear face change those inferences and those perceptions? That would be fascinating to look at.
Yeah.
Just one example of how richly predictive this perspective is. Um,
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
and
I did a study with Dan Fessler a few years ago that
mhm.
was not originally it didn't originate from this work I did on morbid curiosity. It was kind of a separate question in some ways, but now that I've started doing this, I see that maybe subconsciously it was kind of related to these things, or maybe I've just tied it to it after the fact. But it was a study showing that I had this question of like, why are humans sometimes gruesomely violent? Like there's no reason you got to pull someone's entrails out and display them, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
You've already killed someone. You've defeated the enemy. The threat is eliminated. So why are we sometimes gruesomely violent? And the kind of simple answer to that is that we're signaling something. But the question then is like, well, what are we signaling, right? Um, and it seems to be the case that we ran this on different vignettes that were like very, very precisely controlled and only had like minor tweaks to the wording, to kind of change the conditions. It seems to be that you're signaling your formidability because people perceive gruesome actors to be larger, stronger. If you ask them to envision, like, how big is this person? How strong is this person? How tall is this person? Even they imagine people who are gruesomely violent, who commit the same act of violence, but then just take it a little step further, by doing something gross, basically. They imagine them to be bigger, stronger. And of course, that then impacts negotiations. And so that could give insight to like, why do certain terrorist groups behave in certain kinds of ways and send videos of these like horrible acts, right? Why
Mhm.
did the state for hundreds of years do public executions in front of everyone, right? These like gruesome executions that they could have done behind closed doors, but they did them in a way that everyone could see, and interestingly, that everyone wanted to see.
Mhm.
So I think that, yeah, there's we're I think you can again, it just extends to so many different ways, this idea that fear is intrinsically tied to formidability.
Hmm. So that's a good segue into the question of how would you define the horror genre? So a lot of people have thought about what horror is. Do you have a way of defining it that you think fits with your theoretical perspective, that sheds light on how we can categorize something as a horror movie versus a thriller versus, an action movie versus something else?
Yeah. Actually, working on this question helped me think about fear better, because if you think
Mhm.
about what a horror movie, I think everyone agrees, like, and even me to some extent agrees, like, okay, one definition of a horror film is a film that scares you. I don't think that's a great definition because it may not scare me. It might scare you, might not scare Dave. A better definition might be it's a film that is intended to scare you. Like, okay, that's kind of hard to disprove, but that's a decent definition, right? But then the question is, well, why does it scare you, right? That doesn't really tell me anything about the structure of the horror film. It just says that it's meant to scare you or that it does scare you. And so I wasn't very satisfied with that definition. And I thought, surely there must be something, we all seem to, I would say with like 80%, just this is just an intuition, but like, roughly 80% of people would probably agree that X movie is a horror movie or Y movie is a horror movie, right? It's like when we see a horror movie, we kind of know it, like, oh, that's kind of a horror movie, right? So there must be something that we're latching onto that's not just fear, but some components that do produce fear in some people in certain circumstances. So what I landed on is similar to what we just talked about, which is a horror movie or a horror story, a horror narrative is one in which you have a protagonist who is much less formidable than a malicious antagonist. And you don't see that in any other genre. You don't see it in action movies. And again, we have empirical evidence for this, Edgar and I do, that we use that huge Facebook data set that has like 3.5 million people and has their personality traits, their big five and everything. And we looked at like 700 different movies and rated them on this like very precise formula for if they were, how formidable the antagonist was, how formidable the protagonist was. And what you find is that in horror movies, you have high formidability antagonist, low formidability protagonist. In action movies and thrillers, you have both moderately, sort of equally matched, moderately high formidability protagonist and antagonist, which makes sense. Thrillers are kind of a cat and mouse game where you're chasing each other back and forth. Action movies are more of a face-to-face type of story where the hero and the villain are kind of equally matched, right? And that's what generates the action or the violence. Yeah. And then, of course, you have sci-fi and fantasy. Those are a bit lower. The tricky part comes when, you get, what about sci-fi horror, like the movie Alien? Well, there's some evidence that when films take on two genres, and one of those is the horror genre, they tend to like lean into that aspect of it. So if it's a horror sci-fi, it tends to be a horror movie with sci-fi elements or a horror movie with fantasy elements. And so again, I think the thing that they're probably leaning on is strong antagonist, relatively weaker protagonist. And what's interesting is that, and the reason that I started thinking about them this way is that pretty much maps onto a prey animal's experience in the wild. Predators are almost always, certainly mammalian predators, less true in some cases if you use venom or other things, but I think you could make an argument that venom increases your formidability, but it's certainly true that for most prey mammals, their predator is larger, stronger, faster, more formidable generally, has better weaponry. And of course, there's an arms race where the prey animal typically, in like 95% of cases, gets faster or better at hiding. So it's better at escaping. It never confronts. You don't often see gazelles unless they're trapped, confront a cheetah, or a zebra confront a lion unless they're truly trapped. And that's exactly what you find in horror movies. The protagonist always is fleeing until they get trapped, and then they usually get lucky, or they maybe find some weakness that they didn't see before, sort of a David and Goliath kind of thing. But typically they're running away until they're trapped. And that like, to me, that just jumped out as like, well, that's just predator-prey interactions.
Yeah. My favorite movie that I've watched more times than any other movie is the original Jurassic Park movie. It's just like a beautiful movie. And I love about that I don't think of that as a canonical horror movie, but it really is in the sense of it's this thing of it's beautiful. It's it's all the kind of like, well, there's this incredible thing that like dinosaurs finally exist. And I mean, for me, it was like I was a boy. I had never seen a real life dinosaur until I saw this. It was like perfect. I was just like, mwah. Like, so it was just perfect timing for me. But yeah, no, this thing of like, there's this thing, it seems better than you could imagine. And it turns out to be a horror. That's such a wonderful sort of arc. I think it's like one of the most perfect movies. And it's among other genres, a horror movie for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and one of the, for this formula we created to measure this thing, we called it the protagonist vulnerability index. So basically, how vulnerable is the protagonist? In the case of Jurassic Park, you have an incredibly vulnerable or an incredibly formidable antagonist in, like, let's say the T-Rex. But one of the variables in our formula is threat presence. So for what percentage of the narrative is the antagonist actively chasing or a danger to the
Right.
protagonist? Well, in Jurassic Park, they're behind a fence for a long time. So it doesn't matter. It's not just high formidability that triggers fear. It's an asymmetry in formidability, right? And part of that calculation is that highly formidable antagonist pursuing you, or are they in a place where they can pursue you? And for the first part of Jurassic Park, they're not, right? They're things we can look at. It's the same reason we go to a zoo and we'll look at a lion. But if I ask you if you want to get in the lion pit, most people should say no, right? So I think, yeah, there's this contextual difference of like a dangerous thing is only dangerous if it can get you, which is kind of an obvious statement, but it's really important when it comes to these like definitions of these kinds of things, I guess.
Yeah.
I will say that when I was reading about your way of defining horror, it helped me reconceptualize one of my favorite movies, which is Terminator 2: Judgment Day.
Yeah.
Great movie.
And
That's a great
so
movie.
wonderful movie. And I had always thought of it as an action movie and as like the greatest action movie of all time,
Mm.
right? But after reading your thing about horror, it made me realize that actually Terminator 2 is better conceptualized as a horror movie. Because if you think about it, the antagonist is a more advanced Terminator model. And he's chasing a less advanced Terminator model who is way less formidable.
Yeah.
And most of the movie is just involves this like incredibly sophisticated like liquid metal shape-shifting antagonist that's way more formidable than Arnold Schwarzenegger and is just
Right.
chasing him for most of the movie. And so really when you think about it in those terms, it's better conceptualized as a horror movie. And like the antagonist is really scary to have this metallic shapeshifter who can take the form of anyone. Like that's a really powerful ability. And like there's so many moments of the movie where you think he's dead and he just gets up again. He's just like invincible. You can
Right.
shoot him and it just goes right through him and he just like melds back into shape. He blows up and he survives. Like it really is a horror movie. Um, and so that was a pretty cool realization to me
Yeah.
that
And it
it's not
shows
something.
up. It
Yeah,
shows up in our data set like that. It shows
yeah,
up as
really.
it's like right at the cusp.
Mm,
It's like at the low end of the horror movies. So we didn't have,
Mhm.
any reason to have a specific cutoff because it gives you a number, right? This formula
yeah,
gives you like in a math formula gives you a number at the end, right? And there's kind of a gradient. And if you have a big Excel sheet and you've got like uh, IMDb rated genres on this column and PVI or protagonist vulnerability index on this column, you'll see that the first like 100 are just horror, 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 horror. And then you get the like horror sci-fi mixes, horror fantasy mixes. And then you get into like horror action and horror thriller. And
mhm,
Predator was like ranked right with like the bottom part of the horror movies, which
mm,
intuitively again makes sense when you watch the movie. You're like, man, this is a little scary in some ways, right? Like
yeah,
that's kind of a scary story.
yeah,
There were a few others like that too, and like the movie Predator, which obviously, if you've seen it, is about this alien creature that preys upon or hunts for sport humans, right? And the
yeah,
reason that it's not rated higher, or the reason also that it doesn't feel as scary, I think, as some other horror movies, despite that, is that it's a predator who's trying to find the top prey, the best prey it can, the most formidable prey it can, which is like typically these elite group of a military troop that's like an elite group, like the Green Berets or something. And
It's a
so even
predator with
though
principles, right? It
it's a
has
predator
it's a
with principles,
discerning,
it's a
it's
fair
discerning.
fighting, yeah, it's a fair fighting predator.
Yeah.
But that's what it's looking for. It's like what's that old it's the most dangerous game, like where you're
Oh
hunting,
yeah, that's a
it's
great book.
similar
Yeah, the
similar to
short
that, where
story.
it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you are, the antagonist is more powerful. They have better weaponry, they're faster, more elusive, but they're outnumbered. They're facing a group of things, right? And there's good evidence that alliances increase not just obviously like how strong you are, but also how strong you're perceived to be. Um, and they're like, when it comes to humans, like kind of the top humans, like highly trained humans with weapons, with things that increase their formidability. And so that makes it feel kind of like an action movie too, similar with Terminator to some extent. But I would say Predator is an even better example of, man, this feels like an action movie, but it feels like it should be a horror movie because this is a really big bad guy who's literally he is a predator. Right, that's the name of the
mm,
movie. Why is this not a horror movie? And the
mm,
answer is, well, he's fighting people who are, at least when they're grouped together, pretty formidable to him, right? if someone even matched.
if he was hunting a cheerleading squad, it would be a
If
very
he was
different
hunting the
movie.
summer, yeah. If you put him at Camp Crystal Lake, put him at a teen summer camp, it becomes a horror movie instantly.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
David's like, what's the term for writing the screenplay and green? What's the LA lingo for that? Where
Oh, I'm gonna write it on. I'm
you're
gonna
an
write it on
option there. Yeah,
spec. Yeah.
exactly. All right. Yeah. As soon as we, exactly.
I mean, that's a good way to play with those ideas and think about them. Okay, like, well, if Leatherface and Texas Chainsaw Massacre was 4 feet tall, would that be a horror movie? Well, maybe not, right? Or if Jason, if you put him against a bunch of from Friday the 13th, if you put him against a bunch of Green Berets, is that a horror movie? No, it's maybe more of an action movie.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. This
And
definition.
you do see that in some of those sequels. You see like where they get in these new contexts where it does shift to more of an action film.
I
Right.
mean, zombie movies are a good example of like playing
Yeah,
with this border between action and horror because
exactly.
sometimes like the protagonists have like shotguns and weapons and they're just blowing up the zombies and then it feels like more of an action movie because they're more
Right.
equally matched.
Right.
But, you know, if again, if it's the cheerleading squad that's being hunted by zombies, it becomes more of a straightforward horror movie. So what do you think is going on with zombie movies?
Yeah, what is
Why
going
are
on with
zombies?
zombies?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What's
Why
up
are
with
zombies
that
so scary?
archetype? Yeah, what is a zombie? Yeah, that's a great.
So I think I just watched 28 Years Later like this past week, which great movie. Definitely leans more action than horror in some ways. There's like some distinct horror elements and then some action elements. Some like very distinct, like, oh my God, this is definitely a horror movie, and then some like a lot of action elements. I think zombie movies are crowd pleasers. It's like some of the biggest horror film hits are zombie movies. World War Z is a great example. One of the highest grossing movies of all time. Certainly one of the highest grossing horror movies of all time. The Walking Dead, probably one of the most watched TV shows of all time. And yeah, the question is why? Because you would think they would actually be more aversive because they're gross. Like zombie movies are some of the grossest horror movies. They love doing like up close shots of their arms falling off or biting their necks and ripping their flesh out. Right.
Mhm.
I think there's two reasons that zombie movies are so popular. I think one is the thing that David just said. Most of them start out kind of scary. It's like nobody knows what's going on and they're incredibly underprepared, and the zombies are overwhelming them, like a more formidable group than the human group. Over time, the human group gets weapons, gets better defenses. They do what humans do, right? They kind of learn and adapt. And it becomes more of almost like an action drama or something, or a thriller, more of a thriller, kind of like a group-based thriller. I think that's one reason. I think the other reason is that zombies actually tap into. We haven't really talked about the morbid curiosity scale much yet, but I created this scale to measure trait morbid curiosity, and there are 4 domains to it, right? So there's a domain about violence, so kind of your interest in, let's say, like MMA would be a good example of a high violence score on the morbid curiosity scale. There's one about body violations. That would be an interest in like medical oddities or surgeries or injuries or things like that. There's one about the minds of dangerous people, so sort of understanding and predicting people who act like predators, people who hide their intentions, who are trying to harm you without letting you know it. And then there is supernatural, which is kind of this. It's got a lot of layers to it, but the simple way to say it is that dangers that aren't incredibly clear to us yet, or we don't have good access to understand how dangerous they are. Aliens, ghosts, demons, whatever. Like we get a sense they're dangerous because they're hiding from us and they have these incredible technologies or abilities to slip into other worlds. But because they're not right in front of us, we can't study them well. We can't understand them well. So you have those 4 categories, and they tend to correlate pretty highly, but there are some distinctions between them. And they do load onto this kind of single factor of morbid curiosity. Now, if you look at zombie movies, zombies are human-like, seem to have intentions. Certainly, they're hungry. So they kind of tap into that minds of dangerous people thing. Like, is this person, like, do they have intentions or not? They tap into the violence part because, of course, when a zombie catches you, it enacts incredible violence upon you. The outcome of that violence is body violation because they're kind of rotting. Their flesh is falling off. And then if they catch you, your flesh is falling off. And they tap into the supernatural a little bit because it's not clear why they're doing what they're doing, why they're zombies. Are they humans? Are they something else? Will they change? We don't know enough about them. And so they sort of, there's something for everyone. Like no matter where your morbid curiosity kind of falls, zombie movies have something for you. So I think that combined with the sort of transition they take from early horror, which captures your attention, to more of an action thriller, which maybe sustains your attention a little better. Makes them really good for things like TV shows. That's why The Walking Dead had like 11 seasons and 5 spinoffs or whatever. You know, there's an infinite number of stories you can tell about that, and you can kind of just keep iterating on that.
Yeah, totally. And there's also the contagion element, which also gives rise to all sorts of
Correct.
subplots
Yeah.
and conflicts, where someone is infected, they're going to turn into a zombie, all that, yeah, all that stuff,
Well, and I
which
think
might tap into our
infection,
disgust. Yeah.
exactly. And I think infection too, certainly historically, like pre-germ theory of disease,
Mhm.
um, most diseases, infections were given a supernatural explanation, right? It's something that
Mhm.
we couldn't explain. Like, why is this person getting sick? Why are they getting, open sores all over their body? Why are they acting insane? All of these things that we now attribute to diseases or of various kinds, infectious or otherwise, we used to attribute to supernatural causes. I have a quote in my book about an anthropologist who goes to this tribe that has a really bad guinea worm problem. And so she encourages them to like boil their water so that they can kill the worms. And they kind of laugh at her. And they're like, well, that doesn't stop the witches who are putting the worms there. That doesn't stop the witches from causing these problems. So I think that infection, even when we understand scientifically what it is, like, oh, if I'm sick, I have whatever, a virus or a bacterial infection. Uh, it probably taps into something about like an unknown danger, and that's kind of taps into that supernatural element as well.
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that supernatural category is, I mean, I don't know if the best way to characterize it is supernatural or scientific. In like, I know you're not saying that, but even like for the listeners, in the sense of,
Mm-hmm.
from the evolved psychology perspective, and I think Rob Boyd used to say this all the time, is like all of life is like very causally opaque. This is also a John Tooby point.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
to the extent that there are sort of like known co-relationships, like you don't know why we put this in the food and this is what we do, but we just do it, And
Yeah.
so there's sort of, you can imagine there's selection for this placeholder of like very opaque causality, and we can kind of laugh at people. I like, we had this episode with Brenda Bowser where somebody was killed. It was like a for real like murder where there was like blood on the walls. And David, do you remember what was the attribution?
Oh, how could I forget?
Yeah,
Yeah. So they attributed the murder to a phantasm, or
phantasm.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so like this idea, and I mean Brenda's idea was sort of that was what they attributed to sort of and maybe self-consciously or not, but it doesn't really matter, to sort of quell the repercussions, the social
Right.
repercussions of who did it. It was a way to sort of, stick this to end the conflict there. But I think for everything of like, why is there disease or anything? Yeah, this idea of sort of spirituality, like this placeholder, whatever we want to call that, I assume that's also what we all are doing with science too. Like whatever
Yeah.
we think, whatever forces are, like these occult forces that Newton discovered, right? Like
Yeah.
this just slots into that evolves entry of like the world is causally opaque, and I'm just gonna like, okay, tentative thing, and I'm just gonna stick some story onto it. That's sort of
Yeah.
it's the ontology. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's Aaron Leitner and Ed Hagen. They published a paper a year or two ago that I think is probably the best sort of EvPsych approach to why do we believe in the supernatural that I've seen. And their explanation is that it gives us a starting point to kind of ratchet from and then produce decisions from, to explore identity, to explore space, from, because otherwise, if I ask, well, why did this happen? I have an infinite number of answers. There's an
Right.
infinite number of places I can start. Uh, but if I just have a few assumptions, that an agent caused it,
Right.
that radically constrains the number of possibilities of what happened and how do I deal with it? How do I avoid it? How do I whatever? How do I do anything about it?
Right.
And so even though that's wrong a lot, it's right enough, and it's better than not having any starting point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I
Not
think the starting point we have is, well, maybe someone did it. Well, if someone did it and they weren't here, they must have powers of some kind. If they have those kind of powers, they must be pretty strong. I should probably be afraid of them or try to,
Right.
get away from them or deal with them or collect allies to deal with them.
yeah. to not go too far afield of zombies, and then we can go into something else. But I was also wondering if, because when David was asking that, I had the same question about what's up with zombies, and this idea of contagion, where in addition to sort of the deep structure grammar of there's these things about body violations and about,
Mhm.
formidability, I wonder what you think about sort of these like archetype things where, clearly like people, and Ed Hagen, again to Ed Hagen, there's this long history of sort of zoonotic
Yeah.
infection in people. And a reliably occurring thing is like just differences in people's sort of state, like, am I been
Mhm.
poisoned? Am I sick?
Mhm.
Um, the sort of like these sort of archetypes, like I think it's an easy thing to think, and I imagine many evolutionary psychologists when watching a zombie movie have thought, gee, I wonder if that's because a reliable part of our history has been like people acting weirdly when they're infected. Do you
Yeah.
buy that, or is that too facile, or what do you think?
No, 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 no. I think that's, I would be surprised if that does not contribute to it, right? I think that plays into that, again, kind of the minds of dangerous people aspect of like, well, what's going on with these people? Are they sick? Are they like just violent and awful? Like and I think you see that explicitly made in a lot of zombie movies and TV shows where it's like, well, I think we can find a cure and bring them back, right? I think that they're still
Right,
human underneath. I think that maybe if we just do X, Y, or Z, we can get them back. And I think that plays into that intuition that you just mentioned. That we've had to deal with people who kind of looked and maybe acted like zombies because they were sick and drinking lead polluted water and all kinds of other nasty things that made them crazy.
right,
That was probably not
Mm.
an unusual thing for most of human history. Or
right,
we ran into other species of hominids that didn't speak our language and were acted differently from us and um, maybe looked like monsters of certain kinds of Bigfoot or Yetis or other kinds of things like that. One of
yeah,
my favorite things that I've seen, which I don't know if I believe it or not, but it certainly makes for a good story, is that the existence of the uncanny valley. So this idea that as things become more human looking, we like them until they get about 70 or 80% human looking, and that takes a huge dip, and we don't like them at all. And then when they get like 95% human looking, we start to like them again. One of my favorite things I've seen is that, well, that the reason that we find that creepier, the fact that we find that creepier, a bit scary, suggests that we had something to be scared of in the past for things that looked kind of human but weren't. So
Mm.
other hominid species, right, was I think what they were hinting at, like Neanderthals that were violent or dangerous towards us, or Denisovans, or any other number of, now they've discovered like 4 or 5 different hominid species that existed alongside Homo sapiens. And while I don't think there's any evidence for that claim, it certainly like seems plausible to me that that's one reason why we might have this like strange uncanny valley response to things that look and act pretty human, but there's just like something off about them.
yeah,
Similar with
Mm.
zombies, right? I think a big explanation that before I started doing the work that I'm doing now, that I ran into for why we like zombies, or why we find them scary rather, is that, well, they trigger our uncanny valley response. But then you just the question to ask is, well, what does that even mean? Well, why?
yeah, yeah. This definition of horror too, it strikes me as, there's a population of people for whom almost everything is horror then, and that is children. Right? Because I mean, the world is much more formidable than you. Everyone is more formidable. And I was also thinking about, like a lot of Disney stories are horror, right? If you kind of
They
take this
are.
definition. And so has that been part of and there's a lot to ask about kids and development of
Mhm.
this, but has that been part of the research on like, or is that sort of a blind spot so far? Not in yours, I'm saying, but just sort of generally. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's definitely not a part of my research because it's much more, it takes special training to work with kids and
Sure.
thinking a
Yeah.
certain kind of way and designing experiments in a certain kind of way. And it's something that I'm not an expert at when it comes to those kinds of things. But and it's more difficult IRB wise. There's just a lot of
Yeah.
reasons why working with kids is difficult. Um, but that being said, some of my colleagues at the Recreational Fear Lab are developmental psychologists, and they have done these kinds of studies with kids, specifically looking at things like um, what kinds of stories do daycares or kindergartens teachers tell the students, right? A lot of times they're scary stories, and a lot of times they're scary stories because that's what the kids request. There was a paper that just came out by them that I haven't actually read yet, but it looked at different types of fearful, playful activities that kids engage in. And it turns out they engage, I mean, I kind of skimmed it, they engage in a lot of different scary activities. And they don't look scary to us because we're adults. Like you just said, the world is much more of a horror story to kids because everything is more formidable to them.
Yeah.
So when we watch kids, play even pretend games like tag or hide and seek or whatever, that doesn't look scary to us, but to a kid, hide and seek and tag are just predator prey games, right? It's like
Yeah.
somebody is it, and they're trying to get you, and they're either chasing you or they're looking for you, and you're hiding.
Yeah.
And I think that kids, I give a story in my book of a time when I had this job as a mad scientist where I would do like summer camps, like science summer camps. I was like a knockoff. I was like a knockoff Bill Nye. Like you can't
That's
afford
awesome.
Bill Nye, so
Yeah.
you get this company.
I'm
that I worked
imagining
for.
like blood splattered lab coat.
I wish.
Yeah.
It was more tame than that. It was just like
Yeah.
you teach the kids a wide variety of topics. Everything from forensics and entomology to chemistry and biology. Everything you could do that was interesting enough to keep kids' attention from ages like 4 to 10.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found, I was at the time I was in my 20s, didn't have kids, I never taught kids. It's a different skill set, like I mentioned. One of the things I quickly learned is that you have to take a lot of breaks. Like you gotta give them time to run around and be kids. And they want to play games and they want to do things that are interactive. And I started playing the game Mafia with them, which is like the game Werewolf. If you're familiar with that, I'm sure David, you certainly are. And so the idea is that there's this town and there's these usually two killers and like a sheriff and a doctor, and the rest of the people are just townspeople. And the kids kind of put their heads down and they go to sleep at night. And I play the part of the narrator and I narrate the story of what happens. Like, in this case, the mafia members come out and they killed a member of the community last night. You have to find out who they are and get justice, and you hang them. It's like kind of a violent game, but I kept it very tame because I had 5 to 10-year-olds. I didn't want them going home to their parents and saying, "Oh, I killed my best friend at that mad science camp today."
If they were German kids, they would have been perfectly fine. This is very cultural specific.
Yeah. It turns out
the German,
Well, so what I found was that in one of those papers I mentioned, that's one of the games that kids in Denmark love to play. Like little kids love to play that game.
Yeah.
And I quickly discovered that American kids also love that game when you give them the opportunity. And what was even better is that, when they got good at it and they started understanding the rules, I would let one of them be the narrator so that I didn't have to do it. And because they wanted to play the part of storyteller. But when they were the storyteller, it was like the worst gruesome horror story of all time. Mine was super tame. It would just be, the mafia came to town and they killed a person. You need to figure out who did it, right? I tried to keep it like as vanilla as possible because they were like young kids and not my kids. And then when they became the narrators, it was just like, they had a knife and they shoved it in his stomach and they pulled it all the way up to his head and then they pulled his heart, just like these gruesome, awful things.
Yeah.
So I think kids love exploring those kind of topics in a safe way, right? That's one way for them to kind of play with those ideas and play with like imagine those scenarios and what that would be like, and then learn how to kind of navigate like a horror story, but in a way that's not in their face. It's not a film, right? Like film is very real, looks very real.
Right.
And if you're doing play pretend with your friends and like you're telling the story and there's no visuals, it's much easier to take a step back and kind of navigate that.
Right. It's sort of a callback to this point we made earlier, which is sort of it's the people who feel better after they listen to true crime. It's that maybe this cartoonish view of like we're protecting kids by keeping all these things away from them. By inhibiting that natural curiosity, it might actually backfire, and that letting kids actually sort of in their own sort of titration of this stuff, sort of interact with this stuff. And it's funny too, because, like Germany sort of famously is sort of like I bought when I was living in Germany, I bought a Brothers Grimm German language, kids book. And, even if you read these German fairy tales, and Germans will say this all the time, the English translations of them are still quite bad, but they're often already filtered.
Like toned down.
Way toned down. I mean, it's incredible. Like just sort of like, like cannibalism and like death and like all of these like really, it's kind of a funny thing, and everybody laughs about it. Germans laugh about it, Americans laugh about it. But I do wonder if, there's all this data that like, especially American kids are super anxious, super scared. And there's also concomitant with that is like just this quote unquote helicopter parenting, or just like really trying to, and I wonder if to some degree, it's kind of like this, where it's almost like we have this like hygiene of like we're just trying to keep
Yeah.
it super clean, and it sort of backfires. I wonder if the same thing with sort of like bad things or like scary things. I wonder if a similar thing happens.
Yeah. I mean, I feel pretty confident in saying that it's not good to prevent kids from experiencing fear in a safe way, because then how are they ever going to learn how to deal with that emotion when they're teenagers or adults, right?
Right.
In fact, they're going to think that they should avoid it, and they're
Right.
going to become avoidant, which is
Yeah.
not a great coping style.
Yeah.
And I was in Germany. Last time I was in Germany was like a year ago or 2 years ago, and I went to the Black Forest where all the Grimm's fairy tales are supposedly
Mm.
take place. Right? It's like, man, I can understand why they take place here. It's a frightening, like, it's a very cool place to be. Man, it's like very scary. I could imagine, being there after dark. It just would be all sorts of horrible things I can imagine coming out of like the bowels of that forest.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's I have talk about this more in my book, but less so in my research, because again, I don't really study kids myself, but other people do with respect to this. And I think there's good evidence that, preventing kids from engaging in thrilling play seems to correlate with higher anxiety problems in when they're teenagers and adults, like higher incidence of anxiety disorders. And it makes sense, right? Like if you don't learn how to deal with an emotion, you're not going to get good at dealing with that emotion, right? And I think that's one thing that horror fans do well, right? They consistently confront feeling afraid and feeling anxious, and I think there's some evidence that it actually helps them deal with anxiety. There was a study that I believe it's a preprint right now, but it's with true crime, and it was a diary study looking at people who were true crime fans, and like when did they watch their last true crime show, how were they feeling that day when they watched it, and the day after. And there was pretty good evidence that having watched a true crime show on day X was correlated with lower anxiety on day X plus one, and that feeling anxious was correlated with watching true crime on day X, which is stuff that I've hinted at before. I have a big theoretical paper kind of laying out some of the reasons why this might be with scary narratives generally, like why anxious people seem to be drawn to them sometimes, because that seems like the last thing they should be drawn to. And two, can it actually be useful, or can we leverage it to be useful for some people? And the simple answer is that, like, well, they seem to be drawn to it because anxiety ups your vigilance. And if you're upping your vigilance, that's going to up your vigilance for scary stories too. So you're going to be kind of interested and drawn to that. And then the answer for why it might be helpful in the moment is that if you're feeling, particularly with generalized anxiety, you don't have a source of your anxiety, you're just feeling anxious, right? It's like a really destructive form of anxiety because there's not a lot you can do about it. You can't like change the thing that's making you feel anxious because you don't know what it is. So you get in these big rumination cycles. And then, common advice like, oh, try relaxing, doesn't really work for those people because threat tends to have a premium on your attention and on your cognitive resources. And so when you try to relax, it's just like pretty futile, right? But what you can do is maybe fight fire with fire a little bit. Go turn on a scary story that will capture your attention, or at least compete with ruminating anxious thoughts for your attention. And then it draws you in. If it's a compelling story, if it's a well-written story, well-told story, it'll draw you in, and it'll kind of, you can't really like you can't actively worry about two things at once. Like you can try this, right? Like try like worrying about two different things. You can shift between them, but you can't like hold two of them in your mind at the same time and worry about them. So if you get sucked into this story, you have 90 minutes of like a semi-controlled anxiety, semi-controlled fear. You can pause it. You can watch it with lights on, watch it with a friend. There's a lot of things you could do to kind of tone down and control the source of the anxiety. And then after 90 minutes, the thing that was causing your anxiety now is gone, right? It goes away, the film ends. And it kind of gives you an off-ramp for those rumination cycles and allows your parasympathetic nervous system to activate like it should when a threat goes away, which then physiologically calms you down, right? That's all in the short term. In the long term, we've kind of talked about this. It can give you tools for learning how to deal with anxiety, because when you're watching a scary movie or going to a haunted house or playing a scary game, most people are actually not trying to make it as scary as possible. Like we found this even in haunted house studies that I've done, where we go to a haunted attraction on Halloween. Most people are trying to hit like a sweet spot where like it's really scary, but it's not too much for them to handle. Well, by definition, to do that, you have to regulate how afraid you are, right? You have to regulate how anxious you're feeling in order to hit that sweet spot. And by doing that, you are inherently like just practicing or implicitly practicing cognitive reappraisal skills, emotion regulation skills, things that you can apply when you're feeling afraid or anxious because of something else that's happening in the world. And so if you can train yourself to think about those things and what you're doing to calm yourself down, what you're doing to achieve that sweet spot, you might be able to recognize some of these tools and then apply them in your life outside of horror movies.
Yeah, I like that. So Pascal Boyer and Leonard, who passed away, Michael Moncrief's advisor, they had this great paper about sort of anxiety and OCD, and we won't go into all those details. We should have Pascal on, but this thing about like fear, the emotional fear is sort of there's a situation that needs to be reacted to. What anxiety is harder, and their argument is this is one of the reasons why there's more anxiety disorders than fear disorders. There are obviously phobias, but there's more anxiety disorders, and the idea is that it's sort of the design underlying anxiety is there might be something, and there might be something you can do about it, but it's just more opaque and more indirect. And so it's really interesting how, yeah, if there is this anxiety disorder or you're feeling anxiety, it's basically your evolved system telling you there's things to worry about, and there might be things I need to do, and I don't know what to do, or I don't know what might be the danger. And so if you give people fear, or this sort of like, as you put it, this very titrated, controlled thing, it engages this precautionary system that sort of is getting the cues that it's doing something
right
to against the dangers and the fears. Right. So that's really interesting. It really suggests that, we don't always talk about implications on this podcast, and we've gotten reviews of people wanting implications, but this really suggests that with anxiety, with fear, with people sort of feeling like underpowered, right? Or just sort of like possibly victims, we often have this idea that like to protect them as parents or as society, we want to,
which is a good impulse to have.
Yeah,
it's a noble impulse to have, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like you can see the intentions are well, but it might be that exactly harming them by keeping them away from their own interest in things that might seem scary or morbid or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't go into this trying to, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I didn't go into this like trying to find a practical implication. I'm very much an impractical, theoretical, like love just to play with ideas person. But it just came about as I started studying this. I was like, man, this could, well, to be honest, like how part of the reason it came about is because I would interview horror fans. I would read through, threads where they had written about like why they like horror and what it does for them. And this kept coming up over and over and over again that like, well, when I'm anxious, I seek out horror movies and it helps me. And you read that once or twice and you're like, okay, there's natural variation in people. That's bound to happen in someone probably. But you see it like a lot.
So it's almost like self-medication, like in the same way if you go to an AA meeting, there's a lot of people with anxiety disorders that are undiagnosed, and maybe the same thing for horror movies, although they're doing much better than ethanol-soaked people because they're just, watching fiction.
Yeah. It's like popping an Advil when you get a headache, it's, and so I thought, okay, well, like there's like way too many people saying this for this to be just natural variation in whatever trait, right? Like this seems like there's something going on here. And most people didn't consciously understand that. Some did, but most people didn't consciously understand that. And then I came across this paper. It's really one of the only ones I've seen that was like this, but it was a paper published in, I want to say like 2006 or 7. And these researchers, they were media psychology researchers, and they set up a booth outside of a Blockbuster. For those young people,
for those who know, that was back in the day when you put cassette tapes in, and you had to go to a store to get movies. So
this is a brick and mortar Netflix store. They set up a booth outside of a Blockbuster, and when people came into the store, they would ask them how they're feeling. They wanted to know how does your current mood impact the kind of movie you're going to rent, right? And so they would give them these mood questionnaires. They would go in, they would rent the movie. When they came out, they would say, hey, can you show us what movie you rented? And they went in expecting that people would try to, if they were feeling like sad, they would try to find a happy movie to regulate their mood. If they're feeling anxious, they would, again, try to find kind of a happy movie. If they were feeling, if they were feeling joyous, they would try to find a comedy movie. I didn't really follow their hypotheses very well because it's not the framework that I use. But the important point here is that they predicted that people who were feeling anxious when they went in would seek out something like a happy movie or a comedy to try to relieve that anxiety, which is advice that you give to people when they're anxious, like, oh, go escape into a film, like go watch a happy movie, go watch a comedy. And what they found was the exact opposite. People who were anxious going in were the only people who were more likely to rent horror movies. Um, and at first I was like, well, maybe, they were anxious because they knew they were going to rent a horror movie. Like maybe that's, I was trying to like, steel man it a little bit. I was like, well, maybe they were anxious because they knew they were going to rent a horror movie and that made them feel anxious about how scared they were going to be. But then I thought, well, that would make that person a very clinically anxious person if they were already anxious before they even rented the movie. Like they must have very high trait anxiety, right? Like if you're already feeling anxious before you rent it. So in either case, it seems that feeling anxious or a tendency for anxiety does tend to correlate with an interest in watching something that makes you feel anxious. So that kind of led me down this path of like, okay, well, maybe there's something going on here. Maybe there's some kind of mechanism that's being triggered in anxious people that makes them, one, seek out things that are scary or safe, scary or scary play, and two, can actually help them calm down.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful example of how taking an evolutionary functional perspective can bring new insights and practical
Yeah.
insights as well. Because if you're just thinking about anxiety as just this mental substance of badness and we just have to
Right.
get rid of the badness,
Yes,
well,
yes.
then you're going to fail to understand what anxiety is and how to treat it clinically. But if you understand that anxiety exists for a reason, it has a Darwinian function. It's a
Yeah.
mechanism that is there because it helped our ancestors survive and reproduce in some way. Well, then
Mm-hmm.
you start to think about why is it there? What
Yeah.
is it doing? And the answer is, well, it's there to uh, help us think about and learn about and manage and navigate dangerous, threatening things.
Yeah.
And the way to give the anxiety what it wants is to give us, lessons and knowledge about dangerous things. Like that's ultimately what it's motivating us to do. It's motivating us to figure out what's dangerous, what's threatening, learn about it, master it, navigate it, and deal with it. And if you're preventing the anxiety from doing that, well, the anxiety is never going to go away. The way to
It's going
feed
to
it is to
grow.
actually, it's going to
Yeah.
grow. Exactly.
Yeah.
Until you start,
Yeah.
yeah.
Rosemary's Baby is one of the it's super scary movie. And one of the things that makes it so scary is when she's saying like there's this horrible thing happening. Everyone's like, no, 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 it's all fine. Don't worry about it. And it's like,
Yeah.
like if you know there's a threat and somebody is
Yeah.
telling you like, and everyone around you is like, let's just like relax. That's a
Yeah.
horror movie, right? Like
Yeah.
exactly. So no, I love that idea that like the autonomy of power over things that scare you is the way around anxiety is a great point, David.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
And
think that goes back to when we were talking about like what makes a horror movie. Well, in Rosemary's Baby, there's no big scary antagonist, so how could it be a horror? Well, like she's very vulnerable because she's obviously experiencing an entirely different reality, right? So again, I think our mind's intuition is to say something supernatural, something we can't access is causing this disturbance like in our world and in my reality. And I think that again maps onto things like diseases that cause us to not think clearly or schizophrenia or things like where our perception of the world is just completely shifted and doesn't match what everyone is telling us.
Yeah, and it's sort of a mature view of the world. Like even, I mean, Francis Steen, who I'm not sure what we have to look up where Francis Steen is, but he had this thing. I remember he would talk. He gave a talk when I was a grad student at UCSB, where he talked about how if you think about what you do when you play with your kid, most of it is predation. So like if you
Yes.
tickle your child, I'm so acutely aware of this, and this is like real time prediction of like what would be the most vulnerable parts of my child, and like it's like belly and like and that is like my son laughs hysterically, right? And it's
Yeah.
like it's play around like sort of like preventing predation or like
Mm-hmm.
like chasing after a kid. Like what adults naturally do is pretend it's ratcheted down predation.
Yeah.
And that's like what like a human universal of sort of like adult child play that involves like huge laughter. So I think it's a very mature view of the world to sort of be like danger and hazards and like really the morbid part of life is really also part of like the hilarity and joy of life too.
Yeah.
And it's like you don't have to choose between them. And it's okay to give people who are anxious or scared or feel underpowered like fiction or like or give them like stories that might feel unsafe. Like I think
Mm-hmm.
this notion that we need to keep people safe from the bad things in life, it really sounds like what you're saying is that that's super counterproductive or maybe counterproductive.
Yeah, there's a good Neil Gaiman quote, and I don't know if and I'll probably butcher it a little bit because I don't have it in front of me, but I think he pulled it from somewhere else too. Anyway, the idea, it was something along the lines of, stories aren't great because they tell kids dragons exist. They're great because they tell them how to slay the dragon, right? Like,
Right.
I think horror stories aren't great because they tell you it's not aren't great because they tell you how awful things they can be. They're good because they tell you how to overcome those awful things.
Mm.
Or in the
Interesting.
case of many horror stories, what to avoid to
Yeah.
to what to not do to avoid succumbing to those awful things.
Yeah.
So you have some really interesting empirical evidence for this hypothesis that horror helps us deal with awful things. So I'm thinking of your paper about pandemics, and
Yeah.
so this was during the COVID pandemic. You looked at whether people had watched horror movies about pandemics, and you looked to see whether people who had watched those horror movies about pandemics, how they fared during the pandemic compared to people who had not consumed those movies. So what did you find there?
Yeah, I mean, that came in part. I was bummed because when the pandemic hit, like everyone else, all my in-person stuff had to stop, and I had this really great study with like a cabinet of morbid curiosities I had devised, and it was an eye tracking study. It was like
Mhm.
the study I was most excited about in my PhD, and I got essentially canceled because of that. But it ended up being a good thing in some ways because I got this idea about, well, if I'm in a pandemic, it's kind of a scary thing. Everybody's experiencing it. I wonder if that's related to morbid curiosity and coping and sort of scary play. And so I ran this like very simple study. It was not, this study that I was doing was it was like methodologically complex. I had a lot of moving parts. It was interesting. This was just like an online study with people who are experiencing a thing in the world and measuring their psychological resilience and some of their traits. Right? It's like a very straightforward study, but it's what I could do during the pandemic, especially in those early months of like April and May of 2020. And yeah, I found that people who were horror fans, even after controlling for big five personality traits, income, gender, age, they were more likely to be have to report higher psychological resilience to the early months of the pandemic when things were very unknown and the world actually was like pretty scary. Like in April when they were like, hey, we have a global pandemic for the first time in a long time, probably in anyone's lifetime that's living. Um, Horror fans were doing a little better than other people. We also found that people who had seen just one pandemic movie didn't have to have watched 100 or five of them or whatever. If you had just seen one pandemic movie, you were more likely to be more resilient, psychologically resilient, or exhibit signs of psychological resilience to the pandemic. And then, of course, people who scored high and trait morbid curiosity, again, controlling for things like extroversion, conscientiousness, even neuroticism, um, income, age, gender. They were more likely to experience positive resilience in the face of the pandemic.
That's awesome. So I want to unpack what you mean by psychological resilience. So
Yeah.
what is that? How did you measure it?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to measure that, and it's hard to do with a short questionnaire, regardless of how you do it, right? But there were a ton of resilience scales, even to like disasters. There were like disaster resilience scales that were out there. The problem is a lot of disasters are one-time events: a tornado, a hurricane, a fire, an earthquake. A mass shooting, whatever it might be, they're like these one-time events, and it's like, how are you coping with this a week later, a month later, a year later? With the pandemic, it was like this ongoing thing that we were getting new information every day, but it was becoming more confusing by the day. So there wasn't a good scale that captured that, and so we took kind of the good items, the items that worked from these validated resilience scales of, are you losing sleep more than usual? Are you feeling more anxious than usual? Are you feeling more depressed than usual? How are you feeling about the future? Are you feeling positive about your capabilities of succeeding in the future? We took some of those items that were good and we added a few more or changed the wording a little bit if it seemed like it was too pinpointed to a one-time event to make it like in the past week. How have you felt, right? And then we ran a study in April and we ran one again a month later with the same participants in May, and found that again people who were horror fans or morbidly curious were not losing as much sleep, not feeling as anxious, not feeling as depressed, feeling optimistic about the future, um, just generally having, I guess, like, I don't want to say a positive attitude about it, but they were just like less affected by things that everyone was being affected by with the pandemic that made their life miserable, like being being locked in your apartment or your house for weeks at a time and not knowing what's going on in general, the kind of anxiety that that induces.
Hmm, interesting. I mean, do you think what's going on there is that people who have thought about or consumed fiction about pandemics, they have a greater sense of like, number one, what it is, how bad is it, how to deal
Yeah.
with it, what they should be doing, and that knowledge makes them feel better about it, that they can better navigate it. If things got worse, they would know what to do. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
if you know nothing about what's going on, you just kind of default to panic,
For
and you're
sure.
just trying to and you get into this generalized anxiety state where something bad is happening and you don't understand it, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't know what to do about it, and you're just trying to grope at something, anything you could learn or something, anything you could do. But
Yeah.
presumably the people who have practiced thinking about these things in a safe
Yeah.
context, they will have already learned things and already know something about what they
Yeah.
could be doing, and that
Yeah.
makes them manage the situation better.
I think that's exactly right. I think there were two things going on. I think that's one of the main ones, right? And that's such a
Okay.
simple thing that you could come up with without doing a study. So like intuition, you could say like, oh yeah, well, knowing what a pandemic is like helps you deal with the pandemic. But it's like that's actually a really important insight if it's like, well, they watched the movie Contagion and now they feel better about a real thing that's happening. Like that's an important insight for this idea that scary stories can actually help us deal with things in the real world, right?
Mhm.
And one that hadn't been shown in any kind of way that I could find. I think the other thing that was going on is what we talked about a moment ago of particularly with horror fans, they or morbidly curious people, they have implicitly practiced feeling anxious and feeling afraid in a lot of different scenarios. And so they might be a little bit better at just regulating. They might be feeling those feelings of anxiety, but they might be a little better at regulating them than the average person or than someone who's not morbidly curious at all or does never watches horror movies.
Mhm.
You know, can we translate for so one of the things and we do because we're evolutionary psychologists is sort of translating these intuitive constructs into sort of software level descriptions. This is a
Sure.
hard ask, but like when we're talking about emotion regulation or able to
Mm-hmm.
regulate, do you have a thought or either of you? I mean, I have thoughts too, but like, can we think about sort of what does that mean, sort of in terms of like the underlying software?
I think off the cuff, I would say like let's just look at anxiety because that's normally what we're talking about with these kinds of things. There's a lot of different emotions you could regulate. That's typically the one that if you go to therapy, you're trying to regulate.
Right.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of what that is like mechanistically. There's um, thinking about reappraising the situation, right? So I guess at a software level, like taking a second pass using a different algorithm and seeing if what you're really experiencing is really what as bad as you think it is. There's sort of mistaking facts for feelings is something that a lot of anxious people do, where they say like, if it feels this bad, it must be that bad.
Mm.
And so reevaluating that and saying like, well, just because it feels this bad, like I'm watching a scary movie and I'm feeling really terrified, but nothing bad is happening. So again, kind of a reevaluation of what's going on. And then there's kind of just a dampening of feelings of anxiety. And I don't know what that would look like from a software analogy, but kind of I guess requiring a larger input maybe. Though I think that's not quite right, but something like that where it's like
Mm.
you're receiving the input, but there's kind of a filter you're passing it through, saying like for every 2 bits I get, only give me 1 bit of information or something, where you're dampening that signal because you know consciously that it's not as bad. You're mistaking your facts for feelings or feelings for facts. Uh, but I'd be curious to hear what you think because I hadn't thought about that
Yeah.
about emotion regulation from that sort of software
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. What do you think, David? Or,
I think so. That's interesting. So the way I'm starting to think of it now, just in this moment talking to you, is that when you're stressed or anxious, your body starts producing cortisol, which fills you with energy. So it's preparing you to deal with whatever physiologically demanding threat is in front of you. But there is a kind of computational problem where you have to figure out, well, how much energy do I need? How bad is this threat? How much cortisol should I release? And that's an inherently computational problem. You have to learn things about your environment. You have to process all the different cues. You have to reason about the different cues. And so there are many ways that you could get that problem wrong. You could produce too much cortisol and mobilize too much energy, which is wasting a really metabolically critical resource, or you could not burn enough energy when you really need it to deal with this situation. And so you could think of emotion regulation as just trying to get the balance right. So you're learning about what the threat is, how bad it is, how much energy you need to deal with it. What are the types of things you need to what are the cognitive uh, uh, processes that need to be activated to deal with this threat. And that's sort of what I think of. So the more frequently you deal with the threat, the more you learn about it, the more you understand, like, how bad is it? How much energy do I need to burn? What do I need to be thinking about? What are the steps I need to be taking?
Right.
That's sort of how I'm starting to think of it right now. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essentially right. Right. It's kind of this, again, I think there's you can receive as input physiological signals and perceptions of things. But there's also this, like, humans are really good at receiving as input their own imaginations and imagining, like,
Yeah.
well, wait a minute, what about this? Like counter examples. And that can serve as its own input into these to put the brakes on these kind of things, to put the brakes on
Mm,
the cortisol production, on your adrenaline production, on your general
yeah. Yeah.
sympathetic arousal.
Yeah.
So probably what it is this kind of top down, like second screening or second viewing of what's going on, and then receiving input from that, almost like running two experiments, like the experiment of how I'm feeling, like, well, I'm feeling this way, so that's some input that something is wrong. But then you can kind of run this other imaginary experiment of, like, well, I'm also sitting on my couch and that thing's on a TV, and that's getting its own input into those same mechanisms, that the same threat management mechanisms, that's probably dampening some of that. And I think you can learn to exercise a little bit of, I guess, control over flipping that second screening on or off.
Yeah.
Here's another hypothesis. I'm curious what you think about this. Could it be that with anxiety and fear, that there is a vulnerability for positive feedback loops to start happening? So like when you put a microphone in front of a speaker, you get that shrill, piercing sound because the sound comes out of the speaker and goes into the microphone, which gets amplified, which goes back into the microphone, which gets amplified again until the
Mm-hmm.
sound grows to this horrible shrieking sound. But it could be that there are similar kinds of feedback processes to the inputs and outputs of an emotion. So the outputs of an emotion could be, in some circumstances, perceived as an input to that same emotion. So one of the outputs of fear is physiological arousal, but physiological arousal could also be an input to fear. It could be a cue that, something wrong is happening with your body. A lot of symptoms of, pathogens or illness or poisoning can cause physiological arousals. Feeling feverish, is one example of how physiological arousal could be a cue of danger itself. You mentioned how people mistake facts for feelings, where they use their physiological arousal as a cue that something is really dangerous in the environment, which could then increase the physiological arousal, which could increase the cue that something dangerous is happening, and you could get into a kind of feedback loop there. And so it could be that because the inputs to our emotions are so complex and contextualized, that the input can often become the output, which becomes the input, which becomes the output. And what it means to regulate an emotion is to figure out when you're getting into those kinds of feedback loops, and avoid getting into them, so that you can harness the emotion more effectively and practically. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that that seems essentially correct. I think there are a lot of reasons why, like you said, outputs of something like fear, the common outputs of it, the physiological outputs, even the cognitive outputs, should serve as inputs for fear, right? Because our
Yeah.
bodies are quicker to detect, our bodies and minds are quickly detect things sometimes before our conscious awareness grabs onto them. You think
Hmm.
about like, it's those studies with, like, millisecond reactions to whatever, angry faces or snakes or all kinds of other things. We react very quickly and subconsciously to threats. And then if that gets ratcheted, if that turns on the threat management, the vigilance, um, before we can really catch it, then that serves as its own input. Like, hey, something is wrong, but I don't see what it is yet. Let me turn up my vigilance more. Let me turn up my
Yeah.
fear more. And you just get in this, like, cycle, like you said, of well, if I'm being activated this much, something must be wrong. And it's really hard to kind of push the brakes on that or provide a secondary input that would downregulate that.
Yeah. Just to sort of re-summarize, I think what we're all saying or what you guys are saying is that, and this is sort of the way I think about it, is, because we have such a complicated cognitive architecture, one of the problems is this sort of problem of like relevance of sort of like of all the machinery, which machinery should be used for any particular task or event. And one of the problems is not often too little, but too many systems. So, for example, I'm sure both of you have had this experience of like if performing, you get really nervous and scared and you do worse, right? Because I'm not just thinking about catching the ball or like singing the song. I'm worried about, what people are going to think about me. I'm noticing the people's reaction. If I'm teaching and I'm noticing the student's reaction. And so a lot of sort of like getting better at things is sort of running through this system of there's a system that's sort of like corralling different cognitive systems for this task. And then it's sort of this sampling of like, if we take this system out, do we do better or worse? And I think some of fear and some of what we're talking about is and what emotional regulation is that process, right? Where it's sort of like you in this also people talk about this in real context of if you automate things. So, people who respond to really life or death situations like a lifeguard or a police officer in the military or even like, I used to wrestle, like you would just do these things where a lot of times if somebody is like in a situation where there's a natural disaster or somebody shooting at you, people don't respond well. And the reason why is because it's quote unquote taking them a long time to process what's happening and what to do about it. And so what you want to do is practice or train ahead of time to automate. These are the systems. This is the set of algorithms to turn on in this situation. And what anxiety is, or what emotional regulation is that system or that procedure for sort of figuring out which cocktail or which combination of systems are the sweet spot for this kind of situation. And the thing about worrying about the crowd when you're singing or trying to catch the ball is you're too nervous, right? And that's like, and so like what that regulation system is doing is snipping out worrying about that, and then it becomes automated. That extra like corralling system sort of turns off or gets good at it, and then it's like we're good enough at this. I think that's maybe a way of summarizing what we're talking about in software level terms.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about it's really hard to actively worry about two things at once, right? And so you're either worrying about what people are thinking about you when you're performing, or you're worrying about like what you need to be doing to perform well, right?
Right.
And if you're doing the former, you're probably going to mess up. You're not going to perform as well as you should be doing because you can't focus on that because you're too consumed by the worry of what people are going to think or what happens if you fail or what happens if you forget to do something.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think that description of sort of like I'm distracted or I'm worried about something else is the experience of that software system not being calibrated right yet. Yeah.
Yeah, you're learning what to worry about and how worried you should be about it, I think, is one way.
And I think playing with fearful things and putting yourself in situations where you're getting inputs that you're worried, whether that's like spinning around in circles quickly or climbing a tree as a kid or playing tag or being chased by someone or watching a scary movie or going through a haunted house. There are a lot of different ways to get that feeling. I think they work particularly well when they're embedded in a story because we tend to be kind of narrative creatures first. Like every other creature on earth experiences things first person. And so our minds, I think, and I think Steen might have actually been the person who said this. I think it was Steen and Owen's paper that our minds are just phylogenetically. I mean, we are really good at figuring things out when they're in a first person narrative, which is probably why stories are compelling and why we can learn really well from stories and don't learn very well from facts. Because every other piece of machinery in the human brain for millions of years is adapted to learning things first person.
Right.
And so when you tell a really good first person story and you embed lessons in it, we learn it really easily and really quickly. And we don't even feel like we're learning. It just is enjoyable. Right. And I think that's why horror is somewhat uniquely suited for teaching us how to feel afraid and feel anxious and overcome those feelings.
Yeah, it's almost like, we tend to think of learning as solely about learning a list of facts, but there's another, perhaps even more important kind of learning, which is how to regulate and organize and arrange your emotions, right? Because there's no way that natural selection can know in advance like the exact right configuration of all of your cognitive and physiological and motivational states, that is correct for the situation you're in. You have to learn. You have to learn about the situation and sort of take stuff out, sample different parts of it, as Dave said.
Mhm.
And so emotions themselves, we like to think of it as sort of the opposite of reason and learning. But I think emotions also need practical experience. You need to learn how to deal with them and how to organize them in response to a particular context, which I think is a really important lesson from your work.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a general lesson probably from evolutionary psychology, just that
Yeah,
emotions are many times ecologically rational. And if
yeah.
you can understand that ecological rationality, you understand when it goes wrong or when it misfires when it shouldn't. Especially, we're living. It's not that's not a not my idea, obviously, but we're living in a very different world than what our ancestors lived in for most of their history, right? And so there are going to be some mismatches when it comes to, in particular, these emotion systems that evolved under fairly similar circumstances for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of years.
Yeah. And people often talk about it's scary to confront your emotions. And I wonder if it's the same underlying logic, right? Where it's a similar thing where it's sort of like um, in the same way, maybe we shouldn't let kids avoid all risk or scary things. Maybe one point is that be let like feel emotions and sort of don't run away from that feeling, right?
Yeah, and I think there's this common. I don't know if it's like actually what therapists tell people or if it's what people on social media say therapists say. But you should feel your feelings and you should. But there's a pretty big leap from you should feel your feelings and understand what they are from that to that means they are okay, right? Because then you fall into that trap of mistaking feelings for facts, and it's like because I felt this, I am justified in behaving this way or feeling this way or
Right.
reacting in this way, and it's like that's not quite what that should mean. What it should mean is that you should feel the feeling, understand what it is, try to understand why it happened, and then the next and crucial step is kind of what we talked about here with their emotion regulation. Is that how I should be feeling? Is that the best response I could have? And if not, how can I change that? What parts can I take in and out or turn on and off to kind of adjust that?
Yeah. Are there people sort of in evolutionary psychiatry where, so I mean, I think knowing about what the function of emotions are is a way to sort of distance the emotion from your own experience. And then, or at least it
Mm-hmm.
gives you something of like, so for example, we talked about what the function of anxiety is, and maybe even knowing that information the next time, like, or like when I feel anxiety, like knowing that I know that it gives me something to think about. It's like, what is that thing out in the world that my brain is sort of latching onto? It's a way to sort of like step back from just experiencing the emotion to sort of, you know, it's sort of, cognitive behavioral therapy, but thinking about like
It's
what
yeah.
it, but it's a way to sort of armchair cognitive behavioral therapy yourself is to just have some functional theory of an emotion. I wonder, have people looked at that?
I mean, maybe I'm not too sure. I think one that would work really well. Like Aaron Saul has done an excellent job of like, decomposing anger into
Yeah,
its very mechanistic
we
parts.
talked about anger. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great first place to start with that because I think because of him, like that's helped me like think about anger in an entirely different way, and I think probably it would. I could imagine that being useful in a therapeutic context.
Yeah.
Just again understanding that and then being able to kind of think about because then you can take that second perspective, you can provide the new inputs and say, well, I'm feeling this way probably because XYZ, but really their behaviors were ABC, and so I shouldn't be feeling this way.
Yeah.
And you can kind of begin to, I think, regulate those kinds of emotions.
Yeah. One easy question that probably a lot of you get asked a lot is like, how does somebody start studying morbid curiosity? Were you attacked by a clown as a child, or is yeah,
No. I mean, I've always kind of liked scary things, but it's not like I went to school and I thought, okay, I'm going to study, why I'm interested in this and why we love horror movies. When I was in grad school, like most young, fresh grad students, I was just interested in like everything, and I still kind of am to some extent. But you kind of have to pick a thing and study it a little more deeply. And so at first I got interested in why people were interested in violence. So why do we have, like, in almost every society across the world throughout time, violence is mostly punished and abhorred, but there are certain cases where it's okay and where it's celebrated. And so that was really interesting to me, like how we make this distinction between violence that's okay and violence that's not okay, because it seems like such a thing that, like, should be so black and white, like if anything is black and white, like incredible violence or murdering someone, that should be it, right? But it's like, well, it depends. If it's in a Coliseum in front of 80,000 cheering Romans, maybe it's okay. So I was interested in how we made those distinctions, and I did this eye tracking study to kind of see, do people like look at the scenes differently? Do they describe them differently if it's violent or not violent, or they're not sure? And then I started thinking, well, it's kind of weird that we sometimes enjoy violence. We kind of and violence can be scary. And like, well, we also kind of scare ourselves sometimes for fun. And then I was like, well, I do that too, right? Like I also like scary things. And so I started looking through the literature, and I didn't really find any explanations for why we do that. Matthias Claesen was the only one who'd really done any work on this. This was in like 2016 or so, 2017 maybe.
I think Paul Bloom had some sort of like ideas, but I don't think he did much of the work. I don't think there was much.
And there really wasn't much written about it even. I mean, Pinker had like a line or two in his book on it or something, on the Blank Slate, I think, or maybe I don't know if it was the Blank Slate or maybe one of his other
How the Mind
books.
Works or something.
It may have been How the Mind Works, yeah.
And Paul Bloom has some stuff like on his psych book, which I use for my intro psych class, which is a great book, Psych. It's like, but that
came out much later,
very recently.
Yeah. That came out like in the last 2 years, I think. This would have been like almost 10 years ago now.
No, for sure,
And there's nobody was doing it except this Danish literature scholar, and so I reached out to him, and because he was interested in like horror literature and like what makes horror literature. And I reached out to him. I said, hey, you're the only person I can find that is doing anything like this. Do you want to chat sometime? And so he's like, yeah, well, in fact, I'm doing a haunted house study here in Denmark. Why don't you come over and do it with me this fall? And I was like, okay. So I went to Denmark and I stayed there for about a month, and it was the start of a very long and fruitful collaboration with him. And this is before he'd even started the recreational fear lab sort of properly. And so that's kind of how I got into it. And then, I was talking to my advisor one day. I think I was probably a second year or something, and I was getting ready to sit down and sort of think about what I was going to do for my dissertation proposal. And I said, well, Dario, I've got this project on violence, and I've got this project with the haunted house and fear, and like why people are interested in scary things and violence. And he's like, well, it sounds kind of like morbid curiosity. And I was like, well, yeah, I guess that's right. And then I started looking up morbid curiosity, and I was like, well, nobody's really done anything with this. Like, there are no psychological papers on this. There was like one paper from the 80s that took a very narrow conception of what it might be, and then nobody ever validated the scale, and it was barely cited. So I was like, nobody has really tackled this, and it's related to a lot of different things that I was doing. I had that paper I mentioned earlier with Dan Fessler about gruesomeness. We just kind of started that, like, why are people sometimes gruesomely violent? And so I just had all these topics that eventually became fitted to that broader concept. Mm-hmm. And it just ended up being then, okay, well, I'll try to figure out if these are related in some kind of way.
Right.
That's awesome. It's a great example of how an evolutionary perspective allows you to ask good questions and discover low-hanging fruit that no one else has plucked. Like, it's kind of crazy to me, psychology has been around for more than a century now, and nobody has really looked at this huge aspect of the human experience, which is our fascination with the macabre and with darkness and violence. Like, that's crazy to me. Like,
it was crazy to me. I thought I was wrong. I was like, am I missing an entire portion of the literature that I'm just not seeing somewhere? But it was just that it was one of those things people just took for granted, I guess, or like, I don't know, one of those things. It's like, it's so obvious, let's not look into it, which tend to be the most fruitful areas for especially evolutionary psychology. And I get now, I mean, emails all the time from like undergrads and now graduate students who are like, well, I think I'm gonna do my thesis on this. I'm like, please do. There's like so much low hanging fruit. Like, I can't do it all myself at all. Like, there's so much just like simple questions, simple studies you could do that would be really impactful and really interesting. Even with true crime, it was like, I was blown away that like there was only like one empirical psych paper on true crime when I started studying this, right? It was like from 2013. It was one. It was really good, but there was only one. And it's like that is such a phenomenon. Like hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on this, and hundreds of millions of people consume it, and like we don't understand why, you know. And I think it's just because people have these intuitions, like, oh, they do it because they like to glorify violence, or the things that just are like made up explanations that nobody has ever tested. And it turns out when you start thinking about it a little more clearly and testing some of these ideas, you can come up with some really fascinating explanations that then can lead to, you know, a bunch of other insights.
Right. Respect the phenomenon. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's you know, it's a, you know, it echoes what I said in an earlier episode we did on how to do good evolutionary psychology. I think that might have been it, where, you know, a common criticism you hear about evolutionary psychology is that it tells just so stories and that they're untestable and there's no way to, you know, make predictions with an evolutionary perspective. And my experience actually being in the field and doing evolutionary psychology research is that I have the exact opposite problem, is that it makes too many predictions and there are too many ways to test this. And there aren't enough hours in the day. I wish I had a whole army of researchers to go out and test these predictions. They're just so fruitful and so rich. And that to me is more the problem, is that we just don't have enough resources to go out and test all these ideas. Have you had a similar experience, Colton?
I'm about having it right now. I mean, it's just like anyone listening to this that wants to throw funding my way, I will I will multiply by 5 the number of experiments I'm currently running. It's really just a time and money thing. It's not even, I mean, there's just so much interesting stuff, or like, you know, finding people. It's more fun to do studies with, in my opinion, with other people. It's like finding people who are also interested in this. And I've just, it's really more of, at least in my narrow area that I work in, at least that I primarily work in, it's mostly just a time and resources thing, not a failure of predictions, not a failure of not being able to come up with experiments to test it, you know?
The behavioral, or what is the recreational,
recreational fear lab?
Recreational fear. Okay,
lab.
you have to explain. So that can you explain that, and then that's a lead into, if people are interested in like your work, where can they come across this stuff, and what exists? And I know there's some things or events that are maybe planned too. So can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, I got hooked up with Matthias Claesen, who now is director of the Recreational Fear Lab.
Great name, Recreational Fear Lab.
So
how can you not be curious about a lab called the Recreational Fear Lab? If you had just wear that as a T-shirt, people would be like, "What is that?" Yeah,
I think they do have T-shirts. You might. Okay. I know. I certainly have a hoodie with it on there, so I'm pretty sure they have T-shirts. So it's a lab that Matthias started to study in Aarhus, Denmark, to study why and how we engage with scary play. And I've collaborated with them a lot over the years, more so in my PhD. I would go there, you know, for several weeks at a time, usually in October, and do studies in haunted houses. They were kind of these like ways for us to do field experiments on fear, that in ways that you can't induce in the lab ethically or even like practically. And for us to get like really cool data, everything from physiology to eye tracking to hormones to whatever. So I worked with them for a long time. Still am close with them, but I'm not like officially affiliated with their lab. But yeah, what were the other questions? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Oh, just sort of
where
like
can they find my work?
Yeah.
I mean, my website, if you just type in www.coltanscrivner.com, I've got all of my publications. As soon as they are available, I put them up as a PDF there. There's a link to my Substack, so Morbidly Curious Thoughts. This is kind of where I usually, this paper I mentioned earlier with Edgar about formidability and horror, the horror genre, started as a Substack post that I posted a while back. And Edgar read it and he's like, "Hey, we should do a study on this." And I was like, "I would love to," and it ended up being like one of my favorite papers that I've ever worked on, because it just came from this idea that I had that I got to write about. So on my Substack, I write about things like that like, oh, this is like kind of an interesting, cool idea, or something I've been thinking about, but it's not something usually that I've published about. Yeah. Or if I have, I take the thing I published about and I kind of expand it and think about it a little more freely than you can in an academic paper. And then of course I have a book out on October 7th today, called Morbidly Curious. A Scientist Explains Why We Can't Look Away. And it is it's an interesting book because it's very much a popular science book. You can read it without having any kind of special degree or anything like that. Um, but there's a lot of stuff in it that even people who study topics very similar to mine will have not seen before because I was able to treat it as kind of an exploration, almost like my Substack, like an exploration of lots of ideas that I've been thinking about and tying all those ideas, many of them that are not in academic papers yet, um, tying them together to this sort of more general core theory of why we're intrigued by the macabre. So there's a lot of like new stuff in there if you're a scientist, but also should be very easily accessible to anyone. But yeah.
Cool.
It's a wonderful book. I was fortunate enough to read an advanced copy of it. It's really readable, enjoyable, lots of fun examples from pop culture, and also lots of really good science as well. So I recommend everyone who's listening to pick up a copy.
Thank you. That means a lot. It was first. It was weird. I'd never thought. Not that I never thought I'd write a book, but I certainly didn't think I'd write one this soon. Um, and I was kind of scared at first to do it because it was like, again, a lot of these ideas I had not published on yet, and you're kind of taught in science like if there's not published papers for this, you can't talk about it. It was cool to kind of like mix like here's like what I have empirical evidence for, and then here's all these fun ideas that I'm pretty sure about, but I haven't done the studies yet. Again, not because of a lack of ability to come up with experiments or have testable predictions, but just time and resources. And yeah, if you do read it and there's fun ideas in there, please do those studies.
Yeah, I think
feel free.
We've talked to a lot of evolutionary behavioral scientists, and I think almost every single one, there are exceptions, but almost every single one sort of found it by reading a book. Like it wasn't by reading, like almost always like a book. Like there's something about books that I think, it really like it changes people's lives. So, like there's just something about like the whole package of ideas that really gets people. And I've heard that, many people talk about. It was a book that really changed the course of my life. So
yeah. I mean, I read when I was an undergraduate Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and that was like my book where it just opened my eyes by Robert Sapolsky.
Yeah,
just opened my eyes to this like new way to think about human existence just generally, right? And so that was like super influential. And I came from, again, like you said, a book where he talked about, he certainly cites the sources. He has a lot of sources he cites, but he takes some creative liberty to think about new ideas in it. And I think those are some of the more enriching, interesting places, because you really have freedom as an author to I guess think out loud in some ways, or think along with your audience, with your readers, that you just don't get to do in academic papers, or it's relegated to like one sentence in the discussion.
Right. Thanks to reviewer two, I can speculate about this at a footnote.
It's at a footnote. That's more likely.
Exactly. Yeah. Is there anything we should have asked you?
Ooh, should have asked me. I don't know. I mean, I think you asked me. This is one of the more fun conversations that I've had. I think because both of you are evolutionary psychologists, and I don't often do. I do lots of podcasts, but I don't often do podcasts with evolutionary psychologists in discussion. And so it was really fun to like break some of these ideas down in ways that I just haven't been able to do with other people. So it was very cool, very fun.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're doing it. Just that's kind of what we're doing. It's just to get people a sense of what it's like if we were just all chatting together about what we do. Like that's
and I think evolutionary psychology is especially interesting in that way, because it's like sitting around with an engineer and having them think about like, well, how do we take this apart, and like how do you know this works this way? And we do the same thing but with the mind, right? And so it's like a very different way to sit around and just chat. It's very conducive to interesting discussions, I think, and generative, as David mentioned earlier, like can be super generative if you do it correctly and carefully and thoughtfully.
Yeah, and it's just super cool. I love that you're doing. I think like David's doing stuff about humor. We had recorded recently his about humor. I love that. I study groups in conflict, David does it too, but like, I think it's really important to stick to like foraging and mating and, survival. And even like, I think there's still low hanging fruit for even like stuff like parenting, but I also really like that there's good quality work getting into these more sort of more strange, and less straightforward areas. And I'm really happy just to sort of like watching the field grow, that these things like humor or horror It's not just sort of like, as we said, like bad or joking, like, ridiculous, bad, just so stories, but it's actually starting to get empirical teeth and like sophisticated cognitive science, basically, of these things. And
Mhm.
I just love that. I'm always happy when somebody is like biting off like the serious cognitive science of like a new area. And it's so
Yeah.
thank you for doing that with this. Yeah.
No, I mean, just, honestly, just kind of following what interested me, which is not always good advice, but I got lucky and it ended up being good advice for me. And I think I'm pretty fortunate that I study something that pretty much everyone has an opinion on and has
Yeah.
experienced. And like, it's easy for me to talk to someone it's easy for me to talk to you guys, like, you know, high quality evolutionary psychologists in the field about this topic as it is for me to talk about like some stranger at a bar about this topic. And it's like, everyone has experienced feeling morbidly curious at one time or another. Everyone either usually loves or hates horror movies. And so they have a lot of thoughts about why that is and have experiences with it. And so it's very easy to connect like this topic with just like grounded, real things that people experience. And I think it's easy for like us to sit around and think about certain topics that are super interesting, but maybe don't feel relevant on their face to the average person. But I think I'm lucky that I think my topic is not so much like that. So it's super fun to study because people, I think, can access it quickly and have, in some cases, very generative thoughts about it. Like I said, the whole idea about horror maybe being beneficial came from just regular people, like non-scientists, talking about how they engage with it and what it does. Like that's where that idea came from.
Yeah, yeah. It's not, I mean, one of the themes of this podcast has been respecting people and not
Yeah,
just sort of patronizing toward it. In
yeah,
something like consuming horror or people who are anxious, it's really easy to just sort of, or glorifying violence, right? It's just really
yeah,
easy to just sort of judge that and sort of treat it as like not worth our attention. And I think that's exactly right. That's exactly the wrong way to think about it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I will say your work has shaped my life personally in terms of my relationship with my daughter, who, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, is very morbidly curious. I had an experience a few nights ago where I wanted to I was going to watch James and the Giant Peach with her, so I went into the Apple TV and typed in JA, and then the poster for Jaws came up with like the
Mm.
picture of like the shark's mouth open, and as soon as my daughter saw that, she said, "Oh, I want to watch the shark movie. Can we watch the shark movie instead?" And I had this like inner, so my daughter's she's 3 years old. And so I had
yeah.
this inner debate with myself, like, oh,
Like, should I?
should I watch Jaws? Like, is that going to be too much for her? And then I had my inner Colton Scrivner telling me, hey, you know what? This is actually a normal, healthy part of development that she's curious about this. Let's give it a try. If it's too much, we can
Yeah,
always turn it off. And I
exactly.
ended up
Yeah,
and I ended up watching Jaws with her, and
yeah,
she's so into it. She loved
yeah,
it. And it was funny. I was actually more scared than she was. She was just more kind of like riveted, and she was like asking all these questions about it.
Yeah.
And it was just like a really cool bonding experience. And
yeah.
I appreciate you, allowing that to happen with
No,
me. And I'm sure I'll continue to enjoy, horror movies with her and morbid curiosity with her as she grows up. And that's just been a really cool and special way that your work has affected my life. So,
I appreciate that. Actually means a lot. That's good to hear, and that means a lot. And I think like it would have been a different experience if she had come across it herself and watched it and might have been afraid and not been able to like have you next. Like having her father next to her is that's a comforting thing for a primate, right?
yeah, totally.
And so I think it also allows then you to tackle things that are maybe would have been a little too scary for you initially, but now because you
Yeah.
feel like you're in a secure spot, you can actually engage with them.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And maybe
Yeah.
things that would have scared her, she's more willing to go to you with
Yeah,
them as
exactly.
Yeah.
opposed, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I love that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Colton, thank you so much for being with us. Really, it's really just a fun topic, and I hope everybody has a good Halloween season here in October.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. It was a blast.
Work on your costumes. If you're going to make them. I've as a parent like spent a lot of time like last minute like creating a costume. So if you're going to make it, start now. That's my PSA. David. Well, we can end there. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
All
Well,
right.
Colton, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Yep.
Yeah, this is super fun. Really, like one of the more fun discussions I've had with it. So
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah,
thanks
no,
for that.
we have a lot of fun typically. So, David, we just spent another couple hours together with a guest, and that was a really fun episode. And I'm looking forward to the next one. I don't even know what the next one's going to be because we haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I don't know either. Could be Jordan Peterson, could be
Don't, David, don't debase yourself like that. Come on. No, it could be Lita
or
Cosmes.
it could be a solo episode. Who knows?
Yeah,
Maybe just you and me.
yeah. That that could be scary.
Yeah, that would be it would take the frights to a whole another level.
Yeah. Anyway, but thank you for listening. And David, what can people do to support the podcast materially or existentially?
Well, they can write us a kind review. They can support us on Patreon. They can say, hey, this podcast is awesome on social media, but only if you truly believe that the podcast is awesome. We don't want you to lie on our behalf. So maybe that's the existentially relevant thing they can do is you think about whether you actually do like this podcast and whether it's serving a greater purpose. And if so, maybe think about what your role to play is in that existential project of
Wow.
spreading knowledge and wisdom
It's
about
a
human nature.
really, this is a really grand outro. I like this. I feel like we should have some background music. Maybe we should write some inspiring orchestra music.
Yeah, should we play
Uh,
John Williams in the background of this
exactly.
part?
Yeah. But yeah, but thank you for listening. And yeah, please keep listening and please like and subscribe and tell a friend or an enemy or a neutral third party. Or
Yeah,
just randomly
if you,
talk, shout at somebody in the street, just
yeah,
say,
maybe if you don't like it, that's something you could do. Maybe tell your enemy to listen to it, and then it's really great because then you'll
mm.
waste your enemy's time. So that way, everybody
Oh,
wins.
it's like trans. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, we might have to sketch that out later, a later
Mhm.
date. Okay, thanks again. Take care, everybody. See you next week.
Yep.